and you have been invited as dinner guests to the home of Eleanor Roosevelt, the home called Valkill, located in Hyde Park, New York. Eleanor has just returned from Paris, where the Declaration of Human Rights was passed at the United Nations. She served on the drafting committee, serving as chairperson for 2 years out of 3. Eleanor has invited her friends, colleagues, and family to gather at her home to celebrate the victory with her.
Marge,
Yes.
I'm in the kitchen. Oh my goodness, we have a lot of people visiting tonight. Did we send out that many invitations?
We must have.
Well, we have a table and chairs up here if anyone would like to sit as well. So I was just in the kitchen, and you have to remind me, we're going to have to probably build a bigger kitchen. Because I met a woman named Ann in there. She said she was a friend of yours coming over to help, and I think we were trying to just do the 2-step in there, and I think that it was a little bit small. So I know it's snowing so bad out. Did the plow come yet?
No.
Oh, all right. Well, you might want to tend to what's going on in the with the bottles of sherry and
I'll into the sherry.
So welcome to Valkill, my treasured friends and relatives, fellow newshounds who have never been here before, and my wonderful neighbors. How was it coming over from down the road? Did you use snowshoes? How did you get here?
We had to walk in snowshoes.
Well, I'm so glad that you were able to make it because, and I think that, I know you have some extra room since, your children have moved out. I might need to ask you to put on a few of the people who
Oh, I'd be happy to.
because I think that the snowplow is not even coming.
Probably
And we're already up to 10 inches. I don't know what to do. I wanted to invite all of you into the front door at the back of the house, but I don't think they've cleared the steps yet. So, well, welcome, and thank you for coming on such short notice to hear about my victory at the UN where they passed the Declaration of Human Rights. And I know that many of you have come from far away, and some of my friends from New York came up on the train. How was the train ride up? You must have gotten the last train from Manhattan.
I did. It was slow.
Very slow.
Lots
Well,
of people.
I hope that you're planning to stay. Yes, I hope that you, because I don't think you're going to be getting back in this weather. So I hope that you enjoyed the delicious chicken dinner that was made by my invaluable cook, Marge. And I hope you didn't mind being served buffet in the dining room and finding a comfortable table and chair in the living room to eat. Now, I've tried to walk around and talk to some of you, and it looks like most of you are having a good time. Now, she is very, very good. And it's very hard keeping cooks these days. So please tell Marge later that you enjoyed the dinner. Did she serve you dessert yet?
No.
You didn't have dessert yet, my dear. Well, I think that in a few moments we will have to have some dessert then. Maybe, well, no, I know that she had started preparing it before the snow started. So. Now, I know that I haven't seen several of you since I left Washington. Some of my fellow newshounds and activists down there and volunteers. I am so thankful that you have kept in touch with me and written me letters, phone calls, checking to see how I was doing. My children were very worried that I was going to be very depressed. Well, I thought about it, and you all know when Franklin died, I told all of you the story was over. I was going to pack a few personal items and photographs and have a very quiet life up here in Valkill. But not too much time passed, and I felt very unsatisfied. And I started to think about the fact that I really forgot about how much it was so important for me to champion many causes that I had worked on for decades, like human rights and women's rights, education for women, and self-worth. Now, dear, you've come. I met you at the library, and I asked you if you would come. I thought I talked to your grandmother, and she's a good friend of mine, but I thought it might be too late for you, but I see that you're here having dessert, my dear. What is your name again? Kira. I love that name. So I'm so glad you've come to stay. How's the dessert? I thought the lady over there said we didn't get dessert, but I knew Marge had served dessert. So, I actually, as I said, I really thought about how I was going to continue to do the work that I had done as First Lady, that I really was important to me. And I think that I'm a lot like my Uncle Theodore in that way. I wasn't going to just sit by the fireplace and let life pass me by and knit. I love to knit. I love to knit, but I was not going to sit by the fireplace and let life pass me by. He said it's not worth living unless you're inspired and you are excited about life and excited about doing things. And so I was going to follow him in those footsteps. Now, when Franklin died, President Truman came to me, well, newly appointed President Truman came to me and said, Mrs. Roosevelt, what can I do for you? What can I do for you, President Truman, for you're the one who's in trouble now? Well, what went from a very political, formal, and oftentimes weary relationship turned into what I knew was going to be a lifelong friendship. Now, I know that you might have questions for me about the Declaration of Human Rights. I knew you would make it, Henry. The editor of Life magazine. How did you get here from New York? It must have been a long trip for you. And I see your wife came with you. I'm so honored that you were able to come. Henry and I were newshounds together back in the early 1900s. He actually took the photos at the wedding for me and Franklin. Do you remember? And then we really became friends. Well, so you came up from New York. Are you still in the village?
Yes.
Because I'm down there sometimes. I see some of my friends came as well, but you'll be staying up in the area.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think I'm getting a little bit accommodations as we go along tonight. Yes. So, I know that some people do have questions about my time at the United Nations, but before we do, will you allow me to tell you about my precious Val Kill? Now, as I look around, I see that many of you have never been here before. And as it happens in the Northeast at this time of year, we do have snowstorms and very cold temperatures. And I see that we are having quite a blizzard outside. As I said, could we please call about that shoveling or the plow? That young man was supposed to come with his truck.
He's on his way.
Oh, thank you, Marge. So, you must promise me that you will all come back in the spring when the roses are in bloom. You know I love roses. And you will take the 1 mile walk with me up to Top Cottage. The view from there is so beautiful. Now, as you probably remember, that was Franklin's sanctuary. He built it during his second term, and he used to go up there a lot to get away, but I didn't want to get away. I always liked being around all the news people because I was a news person myself. So I don't really go up there very much. I do take my walk with Fala, but And as you know, I just got back very recently from Paris a few days ago, and I have not been around for quite a long time, here and there, but I'm going to be so happy this spring to get down in the dirt again and plant my herbs in my garden. And this my Aunt Edith taught me. My Aunt Edith Roosevelt, she taught me about tending the garden, and I am going to be so excited. So you'll have to come back in the spring when the roses are in bloom, when we can have a meal from my garden, and we can all enjoy each other. Now, Val Kill was not my idea. It was Franklin's big idea. And I might tell you that Val Kill means Valley Stream. And if you look around the house, you'll see many beautiful photos of Val Kill. But it was not my idea. One day, it had to be, I think, 1924. The month was August. And Franklin and I were out for a picnic. Now, we love picnics in our youth. I need to take a little tea. Marge, I see you prepared for me a little plate. I am so happy. You can see I haven't even unpacked yet. So we were on a picnic. Can everyone hear me? I'm a little congested. Can you hear me back here? Oh, good. We got a very big crowd. Did we have enough plates?
We might have newspaper plates.
So, Franklin and I love picnics, and we were out about 2 miles east of Springwood, the family home, having a picnic. And this particular day, 2 of my very good friends, Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, were with us. The girls were lamenting that this was going to be the last picnic of the year because Franklin's mother Sarah was going to close the big house and we wouldn't have any place to go. Well, Franklin said, I'll build you a cottage so that you can come and go as you please. I must have looked at him funny because he said to me, silly girl, this land does not belong to my mother. I bought this land, and I will build whatever I like on it. So he hired an architect, and he built a little cottage, which he called the shack. And this was where I found myself. This was where I would go and enjoy myself with my friends and grow as an individual. So I hope that you will come back when we can take a little hike around the property. Anyway, questions. Anyone have a question for me about the United Nations? I know that's why you all came. Is there a question? Oh, I'd love to answer that for you, but I think I do have another question that has to come first. Yes, my dear, how are you?
Thank you.
And this is one of the reporters from the New York Times, and I knew that she had asked me while I was going around to the tables, excuse me, she had asked me while I was going around to the chairs and tables if she could ask a question that everyone would probably need to hear. So I'd appreciate your kindness. And I'm not yelling at you, am I? Oh, okay. Your question, please.
Mrs. Roosevelt, I must admit I have limited knowledge of how you came to be the chair of the committee. What started it all?
Oh, yes, and I know that you are going to write about this in the Times. How are you feeling? I heard that you were a little under the weather. So, but are you going to be able to make it back to home tonight?
No, I'm going to stay at her house.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay. I think she's a great host, and she loves to do tea, so I think you, yes. So how did I come to be the chairperson of the committee? I mean, how did I come to go to in the first place? Wow, let me see. Well, it all began, really, with Franklin. Now, my dear Franklin, as you know, loved freedom. It was very important for him to have freedom for everyone, as it was expressed in his speech, which he called the Four Freedoms, and which, of course, Norman Rockwell immortalized with his paintings. He was supposed to come tonight, but he couldn't make it in from Vermont. It's snowing even worse there. So Franklin's dream was to have an organization where all the countries could get together so this terrible, terrible thing that happened during the war would never happen again. Now, as you know, they did make an attempt at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington to have a meeting, but he wanted something more solid to happen. And as fate would have it, divine intervention changed my life forever, because unfortunately Franklin did not live to see this happen. Well, my children were extremely worried about me. They were telling me how depressed I was, and how they were worried about me, and how I wasn't going to be doing much with my life. Well, I thought a little bit about that, and then I was in my apartment in Greenwich Village. Now, I see that some of my friends from Greenwich Village made it up. You made it up here on the train? My ladies who I was having lunch with, it was December 1945. We were having lunch, you remember this, don't you? We were having lunch at my apartment in Greenwich Village, and the phone rang. Now, normally I would not answer during a luncheon, but something told me I needed to. Hello? Hello? Yes? President Truman, how are you? Yes? Yes, I'm doing very well. In fact, I have my dear lady friends from the building for lunch. Yes? Well, that is a very interesting thought. I'd have to give that some thought, sir. Would it be all right if I called you back tomorrow? All right, I will call you in the morning. Have a good evening. Well, that was President Truman. And he was asking me if I could go to London as one of the first delegates to form the United Nations. I thought a lot about it, and I said something to my friends at the table. I said, I have no experience in foreign affairs. How could I be a delegate to the United Nations? And one of you, I won't say which one, said to me, President Truman doesn't have much foreign policy experience either, so I think you'll just do fine. Well, I thought a lot about it. I discussed it with my son, Elliot, and I decided I would probably go. But first, I had to be approved. I had to be approved by the House and Senate. And believe it or not, there were several people who didn't want me to go. Now, President Truman, really, I think he was very, very much in favor of me as a delegate, but I think he also wanted to keep the Roosevelt name in the mix. But there were a few senators who thought I might be a loose cannon. But one, whose name I will not mention, voted against me. Do you remember reading about that in the paper? Yes. He decided that he did not like my work on civil rights, and I was not going to stop that. But he voted against me. But all told, I was approved. And I said to myself, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, you must do the thing you think you cannot do, as I boarded the Queen Elizabeth for London. Now, this was on New Year's Day, 1946. I packed a very large suitcase. But I have to admit, my briefcase was much heavier than my suitcase. It was bulging with items because I was going to have to do a lot of studying on my way. I barely came out of my cabin except to walk the decks because I do feel that I need to be in shape. Is that a good response, my dear? And that will be fine for the paper. Thank you. Now, you had a question. I think that I've known you for a very long time.
Absolutely.
From Good Housekeeping magazine. And I know that you have interviewed me, and we worked together on an article at one point. And I would like to know if you could repeat the question.
What was it like being the only woman at this meeting?
Oh, the first woman, yes.
Or the
Well,
first woman?
I will say that it was quite a challenge. And I will say that at first, the men on the committee were not very happy to see me. And you know, patience and persistence are two of my favorite words. I had a lot of experience through the years with patience and persistence. You know, it is 1948, and I began that practice a very long time ago. But I think that I knew that it was not the first time I was the only woman in circumstance, or the first woman in a circumstance. Many times I found myself surrounded by coal miners or Navy men during the war. So I knew that I would probably have to work very hard and have a good sense of humor, and they would have to accept me. Well, it didn't exactly happen that way, but I worked very hard and was very well prepared, and I guess I impressed the men I was working with, because first I was put on a very sensitive committee, committee number 3, which was taking care of the refugees and the orphans. And then I guess they saw how hard I worked. So they asked me to chair the committee to draft the Declaration of Human Rights. And I guess I did a pretty good job. I think the Good Housekeeping would really enjoy an article about that. Any other questions?
Yes.
I think this is kind of a follow-up. What was the most challenging part of heading the committee to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
I knew, I anticipated that you would ask me that question.
I'm sure you're ready.
And I remember that I met you so many years ago at the library, and we've been friends forever. And sometimes when I'm writing my day column and I'm, thinking about what I'm going to write, I ask you, and you are very good about giving me feedback because you're in town with me. So I did think a lot about what I would write in that as an answer to that question on my way home from Europe. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read it. But I haven't finished, and let me know how it sounds. So I'm going to sit down for a moment and get my book that I've been writing in. You asked me what the most challenging
Part of heading the committee.
Yes, that is exactly what I started writing about, because I had a feeling that would be a good question. Members of the commission included representatives from Lebanon, France, India, China, Canada, and the Soviet Union. Coming from countries with fundamental differences in their political and economic systems, they often disagreed about which rights would be included or which are the most important. It was at these times when I used my experience working with a diverse group of people. I overheard one of the committee members saying the following about me. Eleanor's sheer force of personality contributed greatly to the successful outcome. He told his fellow committee members that I worked very hard and had a good combination of warmth, charm, and humor, and that I was doggedly persistent. I can't imagine where he got that one from. Does that sound good for the column? I'm going to be working on it.
Mrs. Roosevelt, what will the information about the final meeting appear in your My Day column?
Well, I know that you will be waiting because I know, being my neighbor in New York, that you always get the newspaper very early so that you can read it, and then we discuss it, don't we, over a cup of tea. So I thought that I probably would have it ready for the end of this week. But the surprise of the weather, I really thought, my dear, that I was going to have a few people for dinner, and they would go home, and then tomorrow morning I would be able to work on the column. But as it happens, I think that I'm going to be serving breakfast to 50. So I don't know, and I'll have to write about that as well. So I think next week, but I'll let you know.
Thanks.
You're definitely staying tonight, correct? You can be, my friends from New York, you can be up in the bedrooms upstairs because that's where you've stayed before when you've come. Yeah. I think I might have somebody else who might have a question. There was someone who had asked me a question about arriving in Europe, and I don't know. Oh my goodness! Yeah, it was you.
Well, I'm sorry.
You're so happy. Was it the dessert that?
When you first arrived in London and traveled around a bit, what did you witness of what was left of war-torn Europe?
Well, I know that being my neighbor, you have heard me talk a little bit about my travels during the war, correct? Yes, and we've had some very, very honest conversations over in Greenwich Village. And, I was in London. I was over at the Buckingham Palace with the King and Queen, and I visited a lot of the soldiers on the front. And, I did my share of visiting the continent, but I was just overwhelmed getting to London after the war ended. I cannot imagine how terrible it looked, that wonderful city. And it was mainly the orphans that tugged at my heart the most. When are we ever going to learn how to avoid these situations instead of having to wait and repair what happens? So I'll be writing more about that through the months in my day. But thank you for that question. So I think, Marge, the plow has arrived. And I really don't think that Fala has been fed. No. All right, so I am going to check on Fala in the kitchen. Okay. If Anne will let me in the kitchen. I don't know if she's going to let me in. I'm going to go check on Fala in the kitchen, see if I could feed him, and see if I can get that nice young man who came with the plow to take Fala for a walk.
All right.
Will you just entertain and see if everybody gets their sherry and dessert?
Okay.
Just please don't leave. I'm going to come back and answer some more questions. So I'm Carol, and I think I think that Ellen introduced me as Eleanor, so I'll introduce myself now if you didn't read the flyer. I'm Carol Cohen. I'm a historian and Actually, I'm writing a little book about Eleanor. So if you do have any anecdotes, like the other day I was at a library and someone slipped a note and said, I knew Eleanor Roosevelt, so will you call me, please? So, so I teach at Lesley, and I love history. And I am enjoying so much going around and talking about Eleanor. And I always get, I love Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor's my hero. And what's a hero? It's a person who you go through life taking advice from in one way or the other and learn lessons from. And I don't know how many people saw CBS Sunday Morning, but I guess Hillary Clinton and her daughter Chelsea wrote a book about 100 gutsy women, and they interviewed her right in front of this statue. What do I do with this thing? I don't want to hold it. All right, so this is in Manhattan on the Upper West Side, and it is a wonderful, larger-than-life statue of Eleanor, so I could actually look up to her. But the original wax cast of the statue is in the Cape Cod Museum of Art in Dennis. So on the left is the wax larger-than-life, full-size statue, and on the right is the original little sculpture that it was made from. And interestingly, I will steal a quote from Hillary Clinton. She said, I feel the statue really reminds me of who Eleanor was, someone who would really think things through and really be kind in her words. And I think that's sort of something she said. So every day I go by Eleanor's quotes. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt was known for so many quotes. Some you know, some you don't realize were hers, and some are stolen by other people. And I was in a store yesterday, and I said, oh, that's one of Eleanor's quotes, and I looked down, and it was someone else's name. And I said, wait a minute, that Eleanor Roosevelt said that. So I love this one. And a few months ago, I was down in Washington doing some research for a new program I've just started doing on Eleanor Roosevelt and her gardens and victory gardens during the war and victory gardens nowadays. And so I was doing some research on that, going to Dumbarton Oaks, the White House, and other places. And I did, of course, go to the monuments. And this is really so much of a perfect portrait of her. But Eleanor was a woman of many, many hats and talents and so many things that people tell me when I go around to talk about her. I love Eleanor Roosevelt. She was such a forward thinker. She was such a woman ahead of her time. She was such a woman who was interested in so many things, and she was. And so you can see in this slide, she was a writer and definitely a news hound. And she loved to knit. I'll talk a little bit more about her knitting in a second. So just a nice little slide. You might not be able to see all of them, but just the headings. Eleanor Roosevelt, the journalist. Eleanor Roosevelt, the party leader. Eleanor Roosevelt, the activist. Eleanor Roosevelt, the diplomat. Eleanor Roosevelt, the educator. Many people don't know that she was a teacher. Eleanor Roosevelt, the grandmother. As I said, lots of quotes, but there are a few that I love to live by every day. You must do the thing you think you cannot do. Every day, there's something that scares me. Every day, she said, there's something that scares her. And she just kept going on. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And in a moment, I'm going to get to that. And with each new day comes new strength and new thoughts. You can often change your circumstances by changing your attitude. And yesterday is history, tomorrow is mystery, and today is a gift. So I have to say that here I am standing up here and looking out at the gift that's going to keep giving on my way home in my car. To look out at all of you wonderful people who came here tonight to hear me talk about Eleanor Roosevelt and to share in one of her favorite desserts. Did everybody get to have dessert? All right, well, you will, right? We're going to keep it open. We're going to keep the dessert bar open. It is snowing out. So it is really a gift. And as far as a gift, thank you to Ellen Dolan and to the Friends of the Library for inviting me here. So a woman is like a tea bag. I don't even have to read this one because you're ahead of me. And anger is only one letter short of danger, and this one is totally current, even though she said this many years ago. So speaking of many years ago, I just want to tell you that I did make a very conscious decision to come out here and have the person announce that it's 1948. Because I wanted to be Eleanor Roosevelt when she was on her own, and when she was in her early 60s, and when she had to go forth without being someone's wife and mother and first lady and whoever. She was on her own and had to really reinvent herself, as many women of her age have to do. And her time at the United Nations, she considers that her greatest accomplishment, the Declaration of Human Rights. Not all her time as First Lady, but her time at the UN. So in 1948, there was a Red Book article that talked about the 10 most popular women. Eleanor Roosevelt got 2/3 of the vote, and the other 8 people split the 1/3. 3 stamps were named after her, were issued in her honor. And a few years ago, there was a contest to reissue the new $20 bill and take Andrew Jackson off of it. I voted for Eleanor. Harriet Tubman won, but it looks to me like nothing is changing at this moment. So friendship with oneself is all important, because without it, one cannot be friends with anyone else in the world. And that is a really important quote, because from a very young age, Eleanor had to be her own best friend. I'm not going to go too much into her history, because there's a million books and movies, and almost every book talks about this. I'm going to pull up one little book here that I did go steal out of the children's section. I do own it, but called Eleanor. And it's a children's picture book that talks about her till she's about 20 years old. And Eleanor Roosevelt was an orphan by the time she was 10. She lost her mother at 9 and her father at 10. And he was a severe alcoholic. He was Teddy Roosevelt's brother. And Eleanor went to live with a really mean grandmother. And then she, at 15, she went to Europe to the Allenswood School in England and met Madame Silvestri. And Madame Silvestri took Eleanor under her wing, and Eleanor traveled throughout Europe with Madame Silvestri and learned foreign languages, etc. But one of the really important, significant things here is that Madame Silvestri recognized Eleanor's talent as a writer. And she really, really promoted Eleanor and pushed her to do her writing. And 27 books later, we can safely say that Eleanor Roosevelt was a writer. And some of them are on the tables here. Eleanor Roosevelt was born into privilege. There's no question about that. Her father taught her about giving back. he did take her to feed the poor. But in 1903 was Eleanor Roosevelt's first entrance into social action when she was part of the first chapter of the Junior League of New York. And she continued throughout her life, feeding others and helping others. So here's a family portrait, because she was also a mother and a grandmother, a mother of 6. I think one died, so 5 children survived. And I think the last I looked, 22 grandchildren and 15 great-grandchildren. So I love this quote, because this says it all about Eleanor. She really did take risks, and I was being truthful about patience and persistence. She didn't let failure stop her, because she really had enough self-image to keep going. And of course, she was a champion of civil rights, and from way back in the 1920s. And I actually, there are many, many stories about Eleanor Roosevelt and civil rights. The one with Marian Anderson is probably the most famous. She also was really good friends with Mary McLeod Bethune, who was one of the early civil rights leaders and, of course, an educator. But most people don't know about when Eleanor Roosevelt went down to Little Rock in 1958 and had a price on her head. The Ku Klux Klan was looking for her, and they did put a bomb on the wheel of her car. These are the things that we don't know a lot about, but Eleanor Roosevelt spent her whole life wanting everybody to be treated equally. And she also was a great patron of the arts, was very involved in the WPA Arts Project, and also even started her own furniture business as part of the Arts Project. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. That produced beautiful furniture and pewter. So Eleanor was everywhere. And of course, she loved to fly. She loved to advertise that she loved to fly. She loved to be on the radio. She loved to be interviewed. She was a great public speaker. And it was really headline news when she was home in the White House. There were many, many cartoons about her. She didn't let anybody let it bother her. But one year, 125,000 miles through the Pacific, her suitcase was always packed. And I really love to try to, duplicate her suitcase over here, but she always had her sensible shoes, her furs, and the one question I'd ask her if I got to meet her is why she wore furs with the head hanging down, because it just doesn't seem to be something she would have done. Don't quote me. And of course her pearls, nowhere without her pearls, and nowhere without her knitting. So Eleanor was everywhere. She, as I said, she was in the South Pacific. She was in Europe. Here she is in a Red Cross uniform during World War II. Here she is in New Zealand during the war. And, of course, at Gandhi's spinning wheel. Down in the coal mines, there wasn't anywhere that she was afraid to go. One year as First Lady, she traveled 44,000 miles. Now, in the last year of her life, she made her 5th trip to the Middle East, to Israel, to try to broker peace in the Middle East. And so, in 1945, we all know she lost Franklin, and she was truly on her own. And as I said, this was the time that I really wanted to portray her and talk to you about her, because most people write about her as First Lady and the affairs and all that other stuff. I wanted to talk about Eleanor, the diplomat, Eleanor the writer, and Eleanor the really strong woman. So here's Val Kill, and during the time she was on her own, she did spend part of her time at Val Kill, and then the other part of her time in New York City in Greenwich Village. She loved New York. She was a native New Yorker, and she was quite a visible figure throughout Manhattan. And of course, she did get asked by President Truman. As I told you, it wasn't, I doubt, a phone call while she was having lunch with her friends. I made that up. But he did really want to have the Roosevelt name continued, the Roosevelt influence in his sphere. But it was true, the quote about him and foreign policy, and her saying, how could she do it? So, of course, she did want to promote the four freedoms, and it was very, very important for her to continue the work that Franklin started and the dream that he had for freedom. And she did board the Queen Elizabeth on New Year's Day in 1946, all packed and ready to go to the first meeting of the United Nations in London. Now, when she was asked to be the chair of the Declaration of Human Rights, which, by the way, was passed on December 10th, 1948, we just passed last year, we're just about to have the 71st anniversary of the passage of the Declaration of Human Rights, and you can't go a day without hearing on the radio something about human rights violations and about human rights. And that could be another 3-hour talk. So Eleanor is probably really scurrying around thinking about what's going on with human rights in this world today. But she was the chairperson 2 years out of 3. The first 2 years they met in New York at the United Nations, and the third year they were in Paris, where they passed the Declaration. And here is the printed version. I do have some things on the table for you to look at. And as I said, it was the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights last December. And here she is. She probably is hiding her knitting under the table. And this was what was part of her speech when it got passed. Where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. And when I look out into an audience like this at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night, when you could be home watching, Chicago Fire or one of those shows, that you're out here and you want to be part of a community and you want to talk to others. I call it like a spontaneous community. Where do all these things begin? They begin with kindness for each other. And so here she is as chairperson, and the day that the Human Rights Declaration was passed in Paris, and her acceptance speech, and her precious Val Kill. So when you were introduced to her, she was inviting you, she had invited you to come to Val Kill in a snowstorm to hear her about her time at the United Nations. She loved Val Kill, and it was the place where she did find herself and grow and emerged as an individual. And it does mean Valley Stream in Dutch. And just quickly to tell you, I alluded to this before, but this was Eleanor Roosevelt's first real home. Because as I said, she was orphaned by 10. She went to live with her grandmother. Then she got shipped to England. Then she married Franklin and had to live with her mother-in-law in various locations and be bossed around by her mother-in-law. So she really didn't have very much of her own home until Val Kill was her home. So as you enter the property, you come across, of course, the Valley Stream and the stone cottage that I referred to that Franklin built for her in 1924. and that her friends Nancy and Marion, wound up living until 1947. And so she had a falling out with them in 1947, so they wouldn't have been at the dinner that you were invited to. Here's the stone cottage, and of course, they did start Valkill Industries in 1926, and it was a company to create high quality reproduction colonial furniture. And the main reason they did this was to to provide work for the farmers and the laborers in the area in the off season, so that they wouldn't go somewhere else to try to work. And so, as I said, they made beautiful reproduction colonial furniture and later on pewter, but because of the Depression, it wound up closing down in 1933. And Eleanor made this huge factory building into her personal home with 20 rooms, 7 bedrooms, and loved the most sleeping up on the sleeping porch almost every season out of the year. Just a little overview of the property. She loved having her swimming pool, and she was deathly afraid of swimming when she was younger because of an accident. And of course, she had her big picnic area, playhouse for the kids, and stables. She loved to ride, gardens, her gardens, as I alluded to. And here's a nice overview of the property. I did mention her gardens, and they are back in bloom. In 1961, when she died, 1962 when she died, it's been a long day. 1962 when she died at 78 years old. They did turn Valkill into apartments, and so I don't know what happened to the gardens, but they're back. She did love her roses. In fact, there was a rose named after her. And she did love her dog Fala that she actually took over. He was Franklin's. And so all over the house you could see wonderful photos of the family and of the Valkill property. And she loved to entertain her grandchildren and have picnics, and I'm sure you've heard of some of the famous picnics that she's had over the years. And every year she would bring 150 boys from the Whitwick School in New York for underprivileged boys and have a picnic for them, and she would read aloud to them. And I was serious about her inviting people into the front door at the back of the house. And this is usually where her most important guests would come. So she did invite pretty well-known people into the back door. When Eleanor didn't go to them, they came to her. So Khrushchev visited, and that was one of her very challenging relationships. And I could go into a lot about Khrushchev if it wasn't 8:05. Winston Churchill. And of course, her front room, when you come in, belonged to her very valued Malvina Tommy Thompson, who was her assistant at the White House, but then came to Valkill with her. And when Malvina moved, Eleanor made this into her office, and it doubled as the room where you would have cocktails while you were waiting for dinner. So if you notice, there's something wrong with this picture. All right, so on my desk I have the same thing. Eleanor Roosevelt was a teacher in New York City when she was young. She was a history teacher. And one of her students made her this nameplate, and she didn't have the heart to change it. And of course, music was always playing, piano as well. And I was really right about having your meal in the living room at a little table, and this is pretty accurate as to what things look like. But Eleanor Roosevelt felt that she had friends in all shapes and sizes and colors. So that's how her house was going to be decorated. This chair in the back was where she talked to Kennedy about running for president, one of the places. And here she is at the Carlisle Hotel with him. But as I said, everywhere you go, you see pictures of the family. However, one of them got hidden at times. And if you really look close, you can see the thumb of the park ranger, because after my last tour, I asked him to pull that aside and hold it for me. Because what Eleanor would do is, if you notice in this picture, she would draw the drape over to hide her mother-in-law's picture when she was at home. And then she would move it over when company came. So Eleanor, as I said, loved to knit. She knitted everywhere. She knitted thousands of mittens and had millions of people knitting with her during the war and other times to send to the troops and to unfortunate people. And she would knit on the beach in her pajamas, and she would knit everywhere. And here's a pattern of her mitten pattern that was found amongst her papers. And here she is at a tea for the Citizens Committee for the Army and Navy, and she's urging people to knit 1 million sweaters by Christmas here at the Waldorf Astoria. So she was a great lady. Dining room, as you notice, her applewood pattern. When she was at the White House, she had her fancy china, but at Valkill, she had what she liked, and I have some of it on my table. And I wasn't lying about the kitchen. Very tiny kitchen, and she had a lot of trouble keeping cooks. Not only was the kitchen tiny, but I'll tell you in a minute why else. But first, I want to tell you that she loved Christmas. And all year long, the Christmas cards are up on the wall in the dining room. She celebrated all year long. She was a very, very faithful woman. And here are all the Christmas cards. They never were taken down. So Eleanor had trouble keeping cooks. And here's Marge, our valuable cook that you met, Marge. Ellen was very nice to follow along. Eleanor would, first of all, the kitchen was so tiny, but the other thing was that Eleanor would leave at the beginning of the day and have 10 people coming for dinner. And along the way, she would collect people and then wind up with 30. And she exasperated people, plus the fact that she was a terrible cook herself. So if you came on any other night but Thursday, you'd probably get a good meal. But if it was the day that Marge was off, you'd probably get eggs. So here's a buffet the way it would have been set up when you came to dinner. And one of her favorite desserts that she served Amelia Earhart at the White House, pink clouds on angels. And I think it's very nice they have the recipe back there for you if you want to take it home. So her My Day column, which I referred to, was syndicated in hundreds of cities, and she wrote thousands and thousands of articles throughout her life, twice a week, until the last year of her life, once a week. Just a nice little cartoon of her writing her My Day column. And she, as I said, wrote 27 books, and really, really prolific writer. And, of course, a very proud newspaper woman. So, Valkill, or well known as the Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site, is the only national park ever dedicated to a First Lady. This was done in 1978 by President Jimmy Carter, and I actually had the opportunity to ask Jimmy Carter's, I think not his chief of staff, but one of his higher ups, I forgot the guy's name, at the JFK Library why this was done. And he told me that it was Rosalind. That Rosalind loved Eleanor Roosevelt, that she was her idol, her mentor, and when she's the one who asked for this to be done. So Valkill is a national park, run by the National Park Service. So in 1962, we lost her at 78 years old, and she is buried at Springwood with Franklin and Fowler in the Rose Garden, surrounded by 105 varieties of roses. When she died, they found 42 items in her wallet. I'm not going to go through all 42, but I will talk a little bit about her United Nations press card, her newspaper hound. She was a real news hound. She was a great businesswoman and a patron of the arts, and a deeply religious woman. Always had her St. Christopher medal and her religious poems with her. But my two favorites, her her license to operate a vehicle, which got revoked when she had an accident on the Taconic Parkway, and it wasn't her first. She got her front teeth knocked out and had to have new front teeth. But my absolute favorite is her license to pack a pistol. So when she was young, Earl Gardner, who was her bodyguard, taught her how to shoot, and so she kept her license. And today is the oldest you'll ever been and the youngest you'll ever be again. And if we were at Valkill today and Eleanor was really here with you, this is how this program would end. Marge, I don't think it has stopped snowing. I think that we need to get several bedrooms ready. Have you opened up the liquor cabinet? Because I think we're going to need a lot of after dinner drinks. And most importantly, do we have enough eggs for breakfast? Now, the other thing, I think I did ask a few people if they would put some guests up, and you're still okay with that, and a few other people I asked. So I thank you very much for coming. And if you are interested in having me talk to anyone that you gather together with, I have my business cards on the table. We also still have dessert back there, correct? And we have some nice things on display for you to look at. And I will be happy on a one-to-one basis answer questions while we're gathering together. And I thank you very much for coming.